previous videos, we have discussed about clause 15, which is the practical completions and defect liability. By now, we have covered the clause 1 to clause 15. There are quite a number of informations which may seem to be confusing, especially when you are first time being exposed to the knowledge related to the PAM contract. In fact, before this, we also discussed about the tendering process. Assuming now this is a real project, there will be tendering process, award of the project, commencement of the project, until to the completions of the work, and then enter into the defect liability period. In case that there are defects, the contractor will need to make good of the defects to clear off all the works that is supposed to be delivered to the employer as stipulated within the contract. In these videos, let us do some recap, link all the informations that we have learned from our previous videos so that you have a bigger picture and gain better understanding regarding the process of a project. First, we talk about the tendering process. You've seen this flowchart before in one of the videos previously. What we're going to do now is to have everything linked together based on what we have learned up to the previous videos. First, the employer has the intentions to carry out a project. The employer is willing to finance the project. Now he is seeking for the contractors to help him to carry out the work. The employer will call for the tender. This will be open for 90 days normally. The employer sends invitations to the contractors or make announcement notifying the contractor regarding the opportunity to acquire the tender. Now the contractors who are interested with the project will come and take the document. At the same time, the contractor will need to pay the fee for the document. The fee is normally somewhere in the range of few hundreds ringgits. Let's say somewhere between 350. After acquiring the document, the contractor will need to do the homework, studies the specifications and bills of quantities, and bidding for the price based on the intended profit margin. Then the contractor will submit the tender together with a deposit. The amount of these deposits are normally stated in the tender document. At this stage, there will be quite a number of contractors submitting the tender. Those who submit for the tenders are known as the tenderer. After expiry of that 90 days, the employer will review the tender and decide to which contractor that the employer will award the project to. There will be one contractor to be awarded. The rest will be rejected. It is possible for the employer to reject all the contractor and award the project to somebody else in the case that the price proposed by the tenderer are not satisfying. Let us look at those tenderers who have the tender being rejected. That means the tenders is not awarded to those contractors. The employer will send notifications to those tenderers, and the deposit which was paid during submitting the tender will be refunded. With that, those contractors not winning the tender will close the case here. If they wish to secure the project, they will need to bid for the other tenders, which can be awarded by the same employer, different project, or awarded by the other employers. That means the losing contractors have no deal with this employer. Now for the winning contractor, the tender will be awarded, and this deposit, which was initially paid by the contractor during submissions of tender document, it will be converted into the earnest money. The employer then sent the letter of award. It is now up to the contractor whether to sign or not to sign the contract with the employer. Let's say now the contractor agreed to sign the contract with the employer. That means the contractor is sincere about the project, and the contract is signed within 14 days. This earnest money, which was converted from the deposit here, will be fully refunded to the contractor. However, if the contractor chooses not to enter the contract with the employer and it has exceeded 14 days, this earnest money will be forfeited, and the employer can call for somebody else to carry out the work. This is the tendering process which occurs before the commencement of the work. Now let us have an overview of the process of the project. This flow chart is an extension from the previous one. Just now there was a letter of award, and now we assume that the contract has been signed with the employer. The timeline now will follow this route. The contractor receives the tenders of award. This happens before the commencement of the work. Within 28 days from the letters of award, the contractor will need to submit a tentative work program to the employer, promising that the project will be completed on time as stipulated in the contract. This work program is not a part of the contract. However, it will be taken as the baseline for the monitoring and management of the project. It serves as a guide for the architect, who is the administrator for the contract, to monitor the progress of the work, whether it is ahead or behind. In the case that the work progress is delayed, immediate remedy actions can be carried out. Based on the conditions of the contract, we know that these are the list of the things need to be considered before the commencement of the project. The contractor will need to plan on the basis of the contract document. The planning should involve the time, cost, and resources. These resources involve the manpowers, materials, and machineries. The contractor will also need to study the contract. In the case that there is any discrepancy between the contract document and the relevant documents within the contract, the contractor will need to send a written notice to notify the architect about the discrepancy before the relevant works are being carried out. The contractor cannot simply make any assumptions, as this could lead to miscommunications and dispute between the contractors and the employer. The relevant details are given in the clause 1 of the PAM contract 2018. If you study the clause carefully, it doesn't mean that the contractor must be able to identify all the discrepancy before the possession of the site or before the commencement of the project. The term here is before the affected work. That means as long as before the affected work, this discrepancy be notified to the architect, immediate actions can be taken. That should be okay. Nevertheless, it would be best to be identified as early as possible, preferably before the commencement of the project. There will be insurance involved. This should have already been taken place, and the insurance should cover for the injuries to the person or damage of the properties, as well as all the risks related to the contractors. There will also be the performance bond to ensure that the contractors carry out his obligations carefully. In the case that the works done by the contractors not meeting the standard, the employer has the right to offset the cost from this performance bond to rectify those. Next, it is the obligations of the contractor to check for the statutory requirements. This is clearly stated in Clause 4 of PAM contract. This is the flowchart for the statutory obligations, where the contractor will need to study and review the document, check for the statutory requirements. If those requirements are met, then the contractor can proceed with the work without any concern. However, if there are violations of certain statutory requirements, the contractor should rectify it. Clause 4 provides the scenarios of all the possible response of the contractor, whether the contractor or the employer side would comply with the statutory requirements. But we know that we cannot violate the statutory requirements, so theoretically the contractor will need to rectify it. He will need to notify the architect in written and waiting for the architect instructions to be issued. Having those architect instructions, the contractors will do the rectification works, and the contractor will be entitled for the variations. In the case that the architect is silent on this, the contractor wish to rectify, and the contractor will do so in order to meet the statutory requirement. The contractor will still be entitled for the variations. Let's say now the contractor silent on the conditions where the statutory requirements are not met, either due to his overlook about the issue or purposely do not wish to rectify. If anything happen when come to the enforcement, the liability will be on the employer theoretically. This is because the owner of the project is the employer. The regulating body will seek for the employer. There will be penalties imposed onto the employer, and this is due to the ignorance of the contractor. The employer should be entitled to set off the costs. Whichever penalties imposed onto the employer will eventually goes to the contractors. It is the obligations to be competent in terms of the statutory requirement, making sure that the statutory requirements are not being violated. Next, the contractor will also need to check for the issue related to the royalties or the intellectual properties. These are clearly stated in Clause 7. Preferably, this should be ratified before they enter into the contract. So now you have the tender document. The contractor will need to study the tender document and check for the issue related to the royalties and the intellectual properties. If there is no such issue, the contract sum will be equals to the cost of the work. In the case that there will be royalties and the intellectual properties issues, the royalty fee will need to be incorporated in the contract. Therefore, the contract sum shall be equals to the cost of the work plus the royalty fee. Let's say now the royalty fee is not incorporated within the contract sum, or it is not being considered within the documents. The contractor will need to notify the architect regarding the issue. Now we will need to see the response of the architect over the matter. If the architect chooses to incorporate the royalties fee, then the contract sum, it will be equals to the cost of the work plus the royalty fee. However, being notified of the potential infringement of these royalties and the intellectual property issue, and the architect still choose not to incorporate the royalty fee, that means they have intentions of violating these royalties and intellectual properties rights. The contractor will need to have safety measures for himself, that he will need to add in the cost for the infringements to avoid himself to pay for the ignorance of the employer side. In this case, the contract sum, it will be equals to the cost of the work plus the cost for the infringement for these royalties and intellectual properties rights. Then in clause 5, it's mentioned about checking for the setting out. This normally happens when the contractors start possessing the site. Before the commencement of the work, the contractor will need to check for the setting out of the construction site. Normally, there will be an initial setting out given by the architect, and it is the obligations of the contractor to check if there is any error, so that it doesn't violate the local authorities in terms of the lot boundary, as well as the precisions of the works. There are two possible outcomes here. It is either the setting out given by the architects with error, or the accurate setting out was given by the architect. If there is no error, the contractor may proceed with the work without any concern. However, if there are errors in terms of the initial setting out, the contractor will need to rectify the setting out at his own cost. But if the contractor is reluctant to carry out the work by himself, the employer or the architect will carry out the setting out corrections on the contractor behalf. The relevant cost will still be imposed onto the contractor. The employer is entitled to offset the cost. Normally, the contractor should choose to rectify on his own, so that he has the powers to control in terms of the progressions of the work, not being delayed by the other peoples. In clause 6, we mention about the checking for the material as requested by the architect. The purpose is for the architect to ensure the quality of the materials, goods and workmanship are in accordance to the specifications and the requirements stipulated in the contract document. Again, you see this flow chart before in our previous videos. It will be based on the wisdom of the architect to intervene and to request for sufficient information as a part of the quality control. The architect can make requests at any of these three places, or the architect can choose to make all the requests at all these three places. Or if the contractor shows a good track record, the architect can also not requesting for any of those. It is very much dependent on the scenarios as well as the reputations of the contractors. First, we have the relevant materials and specifications of the works to ensure that the contractors is providing the works or materials as per what is stipulated within the contract. The architect can request for the evidence or the vouchers related to the specifications of the materials. This is particularly related to the quality of the materials. If the materials to be provided by the contractors not meeting the requirement, the architect will reject it, and the contractor will need to propose a new material in replacement to the initial one. The entire process here will loop until the architect is satisfied with the materials. Then the architect accepts for the materials. When the materials come to the site or before the shipment of the material, architect may also request for some samples to be tested to ensure the qualities. I believe this normally happens when the brand of the material used by the contractors is not that well known or not really familiar by the architect. Probably there are some doubt of the qualities of the materials or the consistency of the material. Then the architect requests for the materials to be tested. If the specifications is not meeting the standards, the architect has the right to reject, and the contractor will need to replace with another material. The process here again will loop until the quality is meeting the standard and being accepted by the architect. Once accepted by the architect, the contractor may proceed with the work. And during the work, the architect has the right to request for the inspections or testing of the works, whether it meets the requirements. This normally happens when the architect possesses some doubt over the work done by the contractor. It can be due to the poor reputations of the contractor, or there are precedent cases of substandard materials, or probably there are non-compliance of the works which is precedence to this. Probably the architect called for the inspections in order to mitigate or to determine the degree of implications of the non-compliance of the precedence works. Let's say now the inspections and the testing works found that the requirements are all met. The cost for the testing and the rectifications is claimable by the contractor. In this case, the contractors have done nothing wrong. Therefore, the contractor should not be made responsible for the cost. However, if the requirements are not met, that means it will be the responsibility of the contractor. The cost of the testing and rectifications will not be claimable by the contractor. The contractor will need to rectify it, and no extensions of time will be allowed, as this should have been avoided in the first place. It is now fully the responsibility of the contractor. There are three possible instructions that can be given by the architect. This is dependent on the situations as well as the wisdoms of the architect. First, whether to remove or demolish and to reconstruct or rectify the work. If the architect instructed so, the contractor will need to carry out. Reluctant to carry out, the employers have the right to hire somebody else for the work, and the cost will be offset from the payments to the contractor. The second option is when the architect allow certain degree of flexibility from the contractor. The contractors are requested to submit method statements for the rectification job. The architect will review whether to accept or to reject the method statement. If it is accepted, then the contractor can proceed with the work in accordance to the method statement. However, if it is rejected by the architect will issue instructions and decide on the methods to be carried out for the work. The method statement here outlines the procedures and the works or the method used by the contractors to rectify the work. The third option that the architect have is to instruct the contractor to leave it unrectified. However, the contractor will be liable for those work, and the relevant cost should be offset from the payment. Most likely, the employer will need to hire somebody else to rectify it, and the cost will be incurred to the contractor. These are about the preparation jobs before the commencement of the work. Now, let us come back to the main timeline here. The contractor received the letter of award and decided to enter contract with the employer. The contractor will need to submit the work program within 21 days from the letters of award, and the contractor will be given possessions of the site. Before commencement of the work, these are the preparations to be carried out by the contractor. Now the works has been commenced. The work will be carried out by the contractor until the dates of completions. During the progressions of the works, there will be instructions from the architect. Whichever instructions given by the architect, it should be in the form of written, known as the architect's instructions. The contractor should comply. If he complies, the case is closed. If the contractor chooses not to comply, the architect will need to send another notice to the contractors asking the contractor to comply. That means the architect is serious about the actions. And if the contractor decided to comply now, the case is closed. But if the contractor is still stubborn not to comply, within 7 days from this written AI, the employer can pay others to do the work, and the relevant costs will be charged onto the contractor. In the case that the instructions is given verbally, evidence will be required. With that, the contractor will need to send a written notice known as the confirmations of architect instructions. And the following step here will be similar here. The contractor will need to comply. If not, architect can issue a notice asking the contractor to comply. If the contractor is still reluctant to comply, there will be actions can be taken by the employer, and the relevant costs will be charged to the contractor. Common sense. If the contractors have the intentions to comply, then the contractor will follow up with the CIA, confirmations of architect instruction. If the contractor intend not to comply, the contractor will need to wait for the architect instruction. If the architect does not issue it, that means the instruction is not official. The contractor do not need to go through this process. But anyway, the principles applies.